Just gonna do a bit of a quickie cleanup on the vacuum pump here. And I think when I put it back together this time, whether I put the new O-ring in or not, I'm gonna put a little bead of RTV around it because I'm tired of it leaking with the brand new O-ring in it. But we'll clean up most of the oil gunge around the pump from it leaking out the gasket. And then we'll get on to cleaning the intake ports themselves. Alright, so on to the intake port cleaning now. I kind of showed, I think earlier on, a little bit of buildup that's around the edges of the port. We want to get rid of that before we put it all back together and start completely fresh. So I'm not going to be able to really film what I'm doing because I'm going to be looking in a mirror. But we've got a couple of tools here. One is just a body trim or a panel trim removal tool for automotive. The other is just a piece of metal that we bent into a hook shape and rounded the end. And the idea is just that you've got the port on the back of the head like that. You want to go straight in without touching the sides, and you go down or up, whichever way you're going to do, and pull out. Because it's into the engine, you can't really brush, and you can't put any chemicals in there because that's all going into the cylinder. And if it's a chemical, it's going to leak past the piston into the oil pan anyways, and then you're diluting your oil. And if you end up with any chunks of dried carbon in there, if they happen to get stuck in the valve seat when the valve closes, then that could potentially cause a valve seal leak problem. And then you've got low compression on that cylinder. It's not going to run very well at all. So all I'm going to do, again, I can't really show it. I'm going to work with these two tools we've got. Go straight into the port, down or sideways or up, whichever way you're at that point, and then try and comb all of the carbon and oil out. What I'm going to do before I do each cylinder is just uncover the camshaft so we can see and put the cylinder in a position so that both valves are closed, so that nothing can get stuck in the valve seat. And what I'll do before I'm finished is use the compressed air, stick the nozzle into the port, just give it one hard blast to get any loose pieces out of the port, and then we'll move on to the next one. So that's about as good as we can get. It's not as clean as I'd like it to be, but the only other way to get it better is to actually take the head off, disassemble it, so that you can use chemicals and brushes and whatever. But if I can get it down here so that you can see. I can't even see what it's seeing, but they're a lot better than they were. They didn't have a lot in them to begin with, but they're good enough for now. If it ever gets an engine rebuild in the future, then I'll use the chemicals and brush it all down, make sure that it's good. But the biggest thing is that there's no air volume restriction. Now the tar stuck to the sides of the ports and the intake and stuff like that definitely causes friction with the flow, but at least it can get as much air as it wants. It's going to be turbulent near the edges because the surface isn't nice and smooth. But that's all we're going to do with that. Need a little bit of cleanup on the sealing surfaces for both the intake manifold and the exhaust manifold at the back there. I'll just probably give them a wipe unless there's something obvious. And then so I think the next thing is to see if we can either find an intake manifold that's already been cleaned, because I think we might have one that came in a car it was already clean, so I don't have to spend the time on mine right now. And then in the future, we'll clean up mine so that it can be swapped onto the next car that needs one. So we got gaskets. The new turbo is here. I've got a new, oh, that's what what was I thinking before about the turbo pressure line? I guess now that the intake port cleaning is done, it could go on. But it would probably make more sense to get the turbo on first and then put the oil line on and be able to fasten it right to it from here, which would be amazing, as opposed to having to do it from way back under the shift box to be able to see and reach what you're doing. So I'll do the little bit of cleaning on the surface of the head here for the intake manifold and exhaust manifold to make sure that they're ready for gaskets. The intake's pretty much spotless. The exhaust has got a bit of, looks like actually oil leakage. And then, yeah, maybe depending on the time by that point, we'll switch over to changing the tie rod assemblies, because I was thinking it would be nice to do that while there's a big gaping hole down there as well, at least on the passenger side. And then, yeah, we'll go get some parts, mainly just those nuts we need for the turbo, and then I'm pretty sure it can go on. I guess technically we need the return line on before the feed line, because there's a tube of, I don't know what you would call it, break-in oil, I guess, for the turbo that you're supposed to put in. But I'm pretty sure if you put it in the top without the return line on, it's just going to leave the turbo. I could be wrong with that. But you're supposed to put that in, and then I think you're supposed to prime it, which the only real way you can do that, unless you have an oil pressurizing system, which I don't have here. We do have one. The only other option, the one guy was saying, is pull the fuse for the injection pump and crank it for like 30 seconds to build oil pressure. Now, I don't like the idea of that, because then when you go to try and start it, it's going to be flooded. Or no, the injection pump shouldn't be firing though, so it shouldn't matter. So that is an option. If my battery's not dead already, it's been like, this is week 3, so yeah, it's been like 2.5 weeks sitting here, and I haven't had the charger on because there's no power back here, so we'll see if it's going to start when it's finally time. But yeah, do a quick cleanup on the gasket surfaces, and then I guess we can get the turbo hung in there with the new gaskets and just one old nut to hold it in place. But there's no real rush on that until we've got the nuts. Got to get it in place and torqued up, and then can connect the pressure line and the return line, and start doing the intake pipes as well. So I think we've got everything we need finally to be able to wrap this job up. So before I start putting things back into the back side of the engine bay, I'm going to go ahead and get these tie rod assemblies changed, so that hopefully by doing it that way there's a lot more space, at least for the passenger side one to access. The driver's side one is way the heck over there anyway, so it's not really much value to be doing it from up here, but that's the plan. Those little factory squeeze clamps that can't be undone, of course, easily, I'm going to try and loosen that off. It's just a crimp there. Try and loosen that with a screwdriver to get the boot off, because you have to be able to, number one, get the boot back to get to the big nut to undo there, and then you have to change the boot over to the new tie rod because the new ones do not come with accordion boots, of course. These are the new tie rod assemblies that I've got to install. But yeah, no boots, so we got to get the boot backed off from the rack to be able to get the tie rod undone, and then we actually have to separate the tie rod from the tie rod end to be able to slide that boot all the way off here. This tie rod I have not had cracked loose. The other side I did to try and do an adjustment when we put new control arms in it. So it's probably going to be challenging. We'll likely have to get the torch going, but that's the plan here. I'm going to struggle through this and try and get the passenger side one changed at least, and then try and do the same on the driver's side. So I think this big inner tie rod nut is around 34 millimeter. Of course I can't make that. We had a 36 millimeter wrench and it was a couple mil too big, so my guess would be somewhere around 34. I thought we had a set of the crow feet, but I can't find them at the moment. That's what you're supposed to use for this generally. I'm going to try this adjustable. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't have much room to turn it at all, so may have to turn the rack back in all the way and do it from above in that space that I've kept. We'll see here. So there we go. I was able to crack it loose with the adjustable from inside the frame rail here. It was flexing way too much when I had it extended all the way, which makes sense, and you don't want to bend the shaft, and you don't want to hurt the seal or whatever, because then it'll be leaking out of the rack next thing you know. So I was able to crack it loose. I don't know anything about what it's going to be like to try and tighten the new one yet, but we're going to find out real soon here. But the next part before that is going to be the fun of getting this nut cracked loose to be able to get the tie rod end off so that we can get our boot off to put onto the new one. So that should be all good to go, other than it being very crusty around the outside, but we'll blow that off before we put the new one in there. And I could not find anything in the manual at all about tightening these, or there's not really any way to torque it unless you've got a conversion adapter to be able to use like a crow's foot, because the torque's different when you use one of those. So I'll probably have to dig into that a little more, because I don't know that I feel comfortable just tightening it up when it's a steering component. So I'll do a little bit of research on that and see what I can find out, so that we're going to have it safe, and we can also get this tie rod apart in the meantime to get the boot and get the new one at least partially installed. Alright, so I got the tie rod end off, and at least got the lock nut cracked loose. It's being a royal pain in the butt as per usual, so I'm going to take it into the vise and mess around with it, and then I'll come back when I've got it off. Alright, so I've got the nut off of there. Yes, ultimately I could have just cut the tie rod, but I hate destroying things just for fun.
So if you can get it apart without spending a ridiculous amount of time to be able to save the pieces, then that's what I usually do. Because you never know what you might need or not need. Make sure I get the right one here, because the tie rod ends are angled opposite directions for left and right. Does this one say that it's a right? No. But the angle of the tie rod end matches is all that matters. There's a new one. And the nut, lock nut for the ball joint, or not ball joint, try that again, tie rod end, which is protected by this nice little plastic cover. And this is the kind of thing you want to see if you get a tie rod end or a ball joint that doesn't have the internal drive cut in the end of it. Don't buy it, because if you go to take, geez, even got marks on it already. If you go to take the tie rod end or the ball joint out at any point for any reason, for anything, like I had to disconnect the ball joint to be able to get the axle shaft down out of the way for doing the turbo. If the nut is stuck on the threads, still too tight to kind of do spinning with fingers, and you crack the taper loose and you can't get the taper to grab again, then the only option to get the nut undone is to grab the taper with vice grips, which destroys it, so you might as well throw it away. So you want to make sure before the taper cracks loose that the threads are all clean and that you've run the nut up and down. Now it's sometimes a problem with a nylock nut, but with the tie rod ends it's not a big deal because you can take the nut right off. With the ball joints on these, you have to pop the taper loose to get the clearance to get the nut off. So you got to make sure that nut will run up and down pretty much loose, like with a finger kind of thing. Otherwise you crack the taper loose on the ball joint and then you can't get the nut undone, and you got to destroy the ball joint to get the nut off. So okay, so this guy, let's put this on here to protect the threads for now. This guy will come off of here, and the nut actually, bugs, go away. The nut actually destroyed the threads all the way out because I guess it had shale in the threads from the part that's actually missing. So yeah, it destroyed the tie rod threads all the way out, which is fine because I don't plan on using this tie rod or reusing it anyways, but rather than cutting it just in case. So that goes with that. That's still a good tie rod end as long as I didn't cook it too much with the torch here, which is why a bigger torch is better, so that you can heat just the spot that you want more quickly, as opposed to by the time I got the nut hot enough with this little tiny map torch, the heat had transferred all the way through the ball joint and it was quite toasty. It's still warm now. So if you want to avoid, like if you were trying to get this undone just for an alignment, which is what I was doing before, if you cook the ball joint or the tie rod or the ball joint, if you cook the tie rod and you liquefy the grease and then it runs out of it, then you're not going to get very long out of that part before it's toast. Okay, so take this off. The main reason I'm putting, I don't know if I mentioned it before, the main reason I'm putting new, wow, look at that. See, that's the kind of thing that I hate. I mean, the lock nut doesn't need to be much, but like, holy, it's like half the width of an original one. I'm assuming these are original. So that kind of stupidity that you get. But anyways, the reason I'm replacing this whole thing is, one, because the threads here that are supposed to allow you to adjust the tie rod end, there's no thread left. That's shale, right, gone there. So, and I also went in to get new tie rod ends, and they wanted $45 just for that piece, and they only wanted $60 for the whole thing. And that way you get new inner tie rod ends as well. So it's like, why would you not do the whole thing? So that's what we're doing. That's nice and rusty. Okay, now this can go on to here, like so. And I hope this will fit where it's supposed to go. That's actually supposed to have a clamp on it too. I didn't even notice that mine didn't have them. There's supposed to be a clamp on the other end of it too, but it was so snug in the groove that it's meant to be in that it would have been no issue that way. Okay, and I'm gonna definitely anti-seize the whole length of the threads for the tie rod end. I don't think I'm gonna put any on the inner because I don't want it to sporadically or spontaneously loosen. So we'll probably just assemble that as is. So anti-seize for this other one. No idea where this needs to be because I don't even know if they're the same. Should have checked this. If they're the same length. Looks like they are. So based on the other one, it was right around there basically. So try and get it close here. Anti-seize all over the place. That's just the nature of it. You deal with it and you carry on. Try to wipe some of the excess off here that I didn't plan on having between the nut and the tie rod end. But to be honest, I would coat the whole thing with it if I wasn't worried about it getting everywhere, because it stops rust. So like this, I'm gonna probably once it's aligned, because there's no point in putting a bunch extra on, they're going to wipe off when they do the alignment. But once it's aligned, I will probably coat whatever threads are exposed and the nut and the hex all with something, anti-seize or whatever I can get on it that'll stay for a while. Because that is the problem on the ones I just took off, right? Threads are gone and the hex is usually pretty rough. Okay, so this goes that way. That. Okay, so this one I think is ready to go on. Yeah. I'm going to do some quick research to figure out what exactly we're going to do for tightening it on the inner end, and then we should be good to go. So I've decided I'm just going to use the big adjustable that I used to loosen the old one and just tighten it as much as I can. On the new one here, I left the threads dry, so there shouldn't be anything that way to cause it to come loose. And it doesn't do any rotating during operation, so my flashlight's gonna die again. So that's all I'm gonna do is use the big adjustable from above. Just can't see it very well. To tighten that, and then I'll fight the boot back on, I guess, and I'll see if I can make that clamp work. I've never tried it yet, but my plan has always been to use those end cut side cutters. The blade is perpendicular to the handles of the pliers. The only problem is if you squeeze too hard, it just cuts the aluminum clamp, or maybe it's stainless, but just cuts the thin metal clamp, and then it's garbage anyway. So if I can find my end cut pliers, I'll maybe try that. You just can't squeeze it very hard. We'll see. Or worst case, I could probably find a gear clamp the right size. Gear clamp's probably easier, but we'll see what happens. So this side is all done. I ended up just switching to gear clamps instead of trying to use that one original clamp, and I didn't have an outer clamp at all, so I've put gear clamps on there. Should work just fine. I just made sure the outer one here, the screw was on an angle that it's not going to potentially hit anything with suspension movement. The boot is outside of that, so theoretically it shouldn't, but you never know. But this side's all done, other than just installing the tie rod end into the knuckle, and I'm not going to do that until
the ball joint is back together on this side because I got to get the axle shaft back up where it goes once the turbo is installed. So that's this tie rod done though, other than final adjustments. I'm not going to show the other side unless I come across something that's drastically different. We can take a quick look. The hardest part is going to be getting to the big nut on this side. That's the accordion boot way down there. So yeah, I have no idea how I'm going to undo this side yet. You can get kits for doing this very job of changing the inner tie rods, or inner tie rod ends. I didn't really look into any such kits. I might have to look and see if I can find the crowfoot set that we have though, because I don't think I'll be able to do what I did on the other side for this side. So if I come up with something worth noting for that, I'll flip the camera back on and mention it. I'm just looking, there might be enough space. Not really. There might be enough space to do something on the back side there. Of course, the manual says you're supposed to remove the steering rack, so yeah, that's not happening. So I'll struggle away with this side a bit here, see if I can get it off and figure something out. And like I said, I'll flip the camera on if I come up with something worth mentioning. All right, so I was able to get the old one off by just using the adjustable with the rack extended all the way this way. I was just careful that I didn't put too much force on it that could potentially bend something. It wasn't very hard to undo, so I've got this is the new one now, all swapped over with the boot and clamps ready. I'm just waiting on a way to tighten that inner tie rod end with the tie rod end as close to the rack as possible for support. If we have a crow's foot large enough, that's probably what I'll do, but for now I've just got it ready to go there. It doesn't affect anything else I'm doing right now, so I'm going to move on to the turbo, get it mounted and torqued in place with the new gaskets and everything, so that we can start putting stuff back together there. And then once I've got the turbo secured and lines and everything hooked up to it, that'll be easier with the intake out of the way. Then we can slap the intake manifold on and start to build up the rest of it. So we are getting close here. I don't think I'll be able to finish it up today, but hopefully this coming weekend get it all done and down and out of here. Get the once it's runnable, get the injection timing set, and then once it's drivable, get the transmission all heated up right up to temperature, and then drop the oil out of it. And I've got new total 75 W80 gear oil for it, because it's been diluted by me spraying the shift tower with PB Blaster. So I don't want the synchros and bearings to get any more wear than they already have due to that. So we'll get that changed out, and if I have any more trouble with the shift tower, I'll pull it out and pack it full of grease as opposed to spraying it with a penetrating oil.